Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 20, 19th Century Western Imperialism 1. So the past few lectures we've been looking at industrialization, and we've seen how industrialization has affected population distribution. We saw, the population move from villages into cities, where they had lived, cramped and dirty conditions, which then led to the spread of diseases like cholera. Similarly, we saw a change in daily life, right, where people left behind the traditional outdoor work as farmers and instead had now 12 to 14-hour days in dangerous, polluted conditions inside the factories. We've also seen the effects on intellectual thought. We saw, Romanticism, the whole art phenomenon being influenced by industrialization with its, love of nature. Then there's also socialism and its belief in the workers. And in terms of national politics, we saw industrialists entering into the House of Commons and then the House of Lords, right? Just like we kind of saw earlier, much earlier, with the merchant class. And then who could forget industrialization's effects on music? Bands like Nine Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson. Wait, that's industrial music, not industrialization. Sorry, I got confused there. So today we're going to kind of look at how industrialization affects trade and, the way the world market really develops with the help of industrialization. And then this whole process kind of leads to the development from colonialism into imperialism. So, industrialization really drives the development of the world market, and then, like I said, the change from what we would see kind of as colonialism into full-blown imperialism. So, talking about trade. In order for trade to be successful, it must be constant and cyclical. This means that there are periods of growth and periods of decline. So here you see some growth, then some decline, but the general trend is always going to be heading up. So you can see there's the growth trend there. So yeah, constant and cyclical is trade has to be that. And in order to make money off of trade, industrialists would try to produce their good as cheaply as possible. That meant that they would want to have the most efficient factories so that they can make more products in less time. And they'd want to buy the raw materials needed for their products for as little as possible, right? So they're looking for the cheapest raw materials. And then those industrialists would then sell their products for as much as the market would allow, because they need enough money for quite a few things to buy more raw materials to keep the factories running, right? Things like upkeep of machinery, and then of course you do have to pay the workers even if it's not that much. So, to keep the machine running, you have to have money. So they're trying to sell their products for that. And then the more ambitious industrialists would also need money in order to build more factories. So then they could create more goods, and that would lead to more profits. An industrialist would also have to live comfortably compared to the others in the classes that they were now entering, right? As these industrialists are entering into the House of Commons and then some who make it all the way up to the House of Lords, they were in a new social stratosphere. This included many of the old, wealthy, landowning class. And so, you try to look like you fit in, and you spend your money to make it look like you belong to this new class. And let's take a a closer look at this picture here, we can see members of this British upper class. And yes, Mugatu is correct. They are in fact breakdance fighting. Look at this guy. That guy is for sure about to, just do some crazy moves. Now, trade begins locally, right, in the areas around the factories. That just makes sense. You sell your products to, the people around you. But there's a problem. The problem is that people will only need so much of your product. Even this lady here, one day will realize that she has enough Pez dispensers. I mean, look at how many she has already. Maybe she won't, I don't know, but most people, most sane individuals will realize that they only need so much of your product. Then you factor in that there are other local industrialists, right, that create competition. They're going to be using the same supplies as you, so that may raise the prices of raw materials. Or they could, cut you off from getting enough supplies yourself. If they enter in and start buying up some raw materials, that's less for you. Maybe you don't have enough now to buy those materials, or you don't have enough materials to produce your finished goods. They could also start marking down their own products, which forces you to then lower your prices, and that cuts into your profits. So this local trade has some setbacks. And what you have to do is you have to then expand your trade into new markets. This increases the number of buyers, right? And it allows you to keep trading once the locals have had their fill. From 1750 to 1850, most trade went across Europe. So, the trade was pretty much confined to Europe. But industrialization meant that there were going to be more products more quickly. And so those European markets began to be saturated. And then that meant that you had to keep expanding your markets in order to keep expanding trade. We kind of saw this earlier. Remember how the Portuguese, they went exploring along Africa, and then they kept going to India, and then they went all the way down to Indonesia? Remember that they didn't just trade. They were establishing or conquering trading colonies like Malacca in 1511. Colonies not only gave access to the local goods in the area, but over time, especially, they served as controlled markets. And what I mean by controlled markets is these were places where Europeans could take the raw materials from the colonies, and then they could also sell their finished goods to those same colonies. So this kind of gets to the point where we were just making, right? Eventually, the local European trade was saturated. If you had colonies, you could then force your products onto the people in those colonies. Just like during the Age of Exploration, where the merchants became richer with the more colonies that they had, and the colonies being in more desirable places, the same is going to be true for industrialists. They get richer because they can obtain raw materials cheaper, especially with the more colonies that they had. And then on top of that, the colonies would represent a whole new group of consumers for their goods. So colonies were very important during the Age of Exploration. They're going to be equally as important in the 19th century when Europeans are trying to expand industrialization, expand their goods, their trading of their goods due to industrialization. The success of the Portuguese and Spanish colonization encouraged other countries like the Netherlands, France, and England to colonize as well. You can see, we looked at this a little bit earlier, France holding up here. They had some islands as well, which they would lose eventually. Of course, we see the British here. There's some Dutch there. But this didn't just happen in the New World, right? I mean, of course it did early on, but most of the New World actually had already gained its independence by the 1830s, in large part due to the Napoleonic Wars. And we're going to look at that whole process of, the New World gaining its independence in a couple lectures. But like I said, it wasn't confined to just the New World. This colonization and then imperialism happened in other parts of the world as well. By the 1850s, England was by far the most successful of the European imperial powers. And this continued still on into 1914, where you can see just how much land they controlled. There's Canada there, a lot of Africa, even a little bit in South America. There's some in Asia, and then Australia as well. So England's presence was massive in the globe, even up until 1914. So now let's take a closer look at what a colonial market would look like. And for this case study, we'll look at India. By 1820, Britain was exporting 50% of the cotton cloth that it made. Of that 50%, half of that went to Europe. Only 6% went to India in 1820, and then most of the rest went to the United States. As the rest of Europe and the United States began to enter the cloth market, they started producing their own cotton cloth for use at home and to sell abroad as well. And then they would also protect themselves using tariffs. And a tariff is a type of tax on imports and or exports, oftentimes on imports. So this meant that, with Europe and the United States now protecting themselves and with these tariffs, as well as producing their own cloth, Britain had to find somewhere else a new market for their own cotton cloth. And we see by 1850, the cotton industry was booming in Great Britain as a result of, all the machines and becoming more efficient and whatnot. So because of the tariffs and their own production, Europe was only buying 16% of British cloth, when before it had been a whole 50% of the cloth that they were exporting. But now you can see how India started to pick up the slack. They went from buying 6% in 1820 to, and this was 6% of a smaller production amount, to 25% of this greater production. So India really picks up the sales that Britain lost when Europe, industrialized itself. And in fact, by 1900, India was buying 40% of Britain's cotton exports. So just a massive increase in India because it was one of these controlled markets. And this had profound effects on India, which is not surprising. There was already an existing cottage industry cloth production system there, one in which European merchants would supply raw cotton to Indian weavers, and then they would later get a finished product back for more raw cotton and other goods. And this was called the Silum system. Sillim. The Silum system was this cottage industry where, like I said, the merchants supplied the raw cotton. The Indian weavers would take that, weave it, and then sell the finished product back to the merchants for more raw cotton and other European goods. And this cotton cloth was a major export for India in the 18th century. So in the 1700s, a major export for India. But because it was handmade, it was a slower and more expensive process. The goods were more expensive as well. As a result, Indian cotton cloth began to be replaced by cheaper industrial cloth. And in India, millions of hand spinners and weavers were displaced. And this is much like we saw in Great Britain itself, right? We talked about how these machines that could make cloth so much faster really put the spinsters and the weavers out in Britain. Same here is true for India. In India, the British also had an advantage in the sense that they had political control over much of the country. So they could kind of use this political control to help phase out the old, Silum system and, replace it by pushing the British cotton on the Indian people. And how much political control did Great Britain have? Well, Queen Victoria adopted the title of Empress of India, and the British Parliament ruled through that Indian civil service and the sepoys, which we mentioned earlier in this course. So, quite a bit of control the British held over India. Now, moving on to Europe's advance into other parts of Asia, specifically China. You'll remember that from early on, Europeans wanted goods like tea, as well as silk and porcelain. Those were always attractive goods that that Europeans wanted in general, as well as spices and a few other things. Now, trade between the West and China had been going on for centuries, and it had always been on China's terms. Those Europeans wanted those goods, the tea, the porcelain, the silk, the spices, and all that China wanted was silver. That's all that they would accept. The Europeans would try to offer them, finished Western goods, whatever they had. But China didn't want any of that. Instead, what they really wanted was just silver. China also controlled the trade by restricting it to just one little area in the city of Guangzhou, Canton, as we call it in English. And here you can see the harbor of Canton. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was more powerful than ever, right? They had, along with the rest of Europe, had defeated Napoleon, and because of their position in imperialism, they were the predominant power in the world, really. So they were stronger. And then they also happened to find a new trading good that the Chinese would really want, and that was opium. Now, opium was illegal to grow, use, or sell in China. So this is completely illegal in China. But since the British controlled India, they could legally grow it in Western India. You know, like I said, they're in control of India, so they can decide what's legal and what's not. They thus can grow opium there. And from Western India, they would smuggle that opium into China. Now, here's the thing about opium, and I'm guessing you probably know this. It is highly addictive. How addictive, you may ask? Well, in 1810, the British sold 4,500 chests of opium. In 1830, they sold 10,000. So just 20 years later, they've more than doubled how much they sold. And then just 8 years after that, in 1838, they smuggled in 40,000 chests of opium into China. So the Chinese were really hooked on this. This good that the British were smuggling in. Here you can see a block of opium and a pipe. And whenever I think of opium, I always remember Elaine on Seinfeld failing a drug test after she ate poppy seeds. I think this might actually become a dated reference now, which is really sad. If you haven't watched Seinfeld, you should watch Seinfeld. Anyways, Elaine, eats some poppy seeds, fails her drug test for opium because of those seeds. Well, that didn't sound good. That was a very, very poor portrayal of Seinfeld. Watch it. Trust me, it's good. Besides being very addictive, opium is also kind of ruinous to the health of people. It had a very, very negative impact on the Chinese population. And here you can see an opium den. This is in Chinatown, but China also hit hard by opium. Now, even though they were smuggling in opium, the British still wanted to expand trade, right? If it was legal, it would be easier for them to sell, and that would mean that they could get more and more goods. And they also wanted to, not be limited to Canton. They wanted more ports open to them so that they could trade, hopefully more, legal opium. So that's what the British wanted. The Chinese wanted two things. The first was to uphold the laws that forbade opium trading, right? They were upset that opium was being smuggled in, so they wanted to uphold the laws that made opium illegal. And the second thing they wanted was to keep foreign influence out of China. China felt that they should be the ones who are making all the decisions, not some Europeans. And the tensions between China and the British led to the Opium War from 1839 to 1842. During this war, the British pretty consistently defeated the Chinese, in part because their soldiers were very well trained, and then they also had a modern navy. And you can see their modern navy here just blowing apart the Chinese navy. And because they were consistently defeated, the Chinese were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, which gave the British quite a few things. One, they got Hong Kong, which they held on to until 1997. They also gained access to 4 different ports besides Canton. And then China had to pay 21 million ounces of silver as an indemnity to the British. So, because they had fought a war, China had to pay 21 million ounces of silver to Great Britain. And remember, silver was what China really wanted from the Europeans. Now they're having to give it away. This war also had a major impact in China. It really shook the ideas that China was a celestial empire. It led people to believe, or to question, just how much the gods were in favor of those ruling, and in favor of China in general. It was a pretty, disheartening war for the Chinese. Obviously, with those terms, the Chinese weren't happy with the Treaty of Nanjing, and then it didn't really satisfy the British either. The British still wanted more and more trade in China. Eventually they realized that, hey, 4 ports wasn't enough for them. They wanted more. So the British, along with soldiers sent by Napoleon III from France, came in and occupied Beijing. And this led to the Second Opium War. When they occupied Beijing, the British and French allowed their soldiers to sack the summer palace of the Chinese emperors. And you can see the fighting went on for 4 years. Just like in the First Opium War, China was pretty consistently defeated, and they were forced to sign another treaty that, in this case, set rules for the opium trade. So opium trade was now legal in China, opened up even more cities and ports to the west, and then it granted European merchants and missionaries more freedoms. So European influence is becoming, greater and greater because of these two opium wars. And here we can see the destruction of the summer palace. There it is when it was still around, and here are some of the remains today of the summer palace. Now, China was not the only case where force was used by a Western country to open up an Asian nation. Japan had been really secluded since the early 1600s. At that time, they ejected all foreigners from Japan, except for there were a few Dutch traders who could trade on this tiny little island off of Japan. And that was the only real interaction that the Japanese had with the West from the early 1600s on. Japan also passed some very strict anti-foreigner laws within their country, and these laws could, from time to time, be enforced rather violently. And it was these laws that provided the United States with an excuse to send a squadron of some modern warships into Japan under the command of Commodore Perry. With these warships, hanging out just outside of the harbor, they threatened the Japanese to sign a treaty with the United States. Obviously one that would be very favorable to the United States, and said, basically, if you don't sign this, we're just going to use our modern warships on you and blow you to kingdom come. This is a perfect example of what we call gunboat diplomacy, right? And this is why it's called gunboat diplomacy. They're using the threat of force, especially by gunboats in this case, to get favorable treaties. And that is gunboat diplomacy. And of course, this Commodore Perry that we're talking about is not the famous Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, who was the older brother who was a Commodore in the War of 1812. But this was, in fact, the younger brother, Matthew Perry. And don't be fooled by these pictures. Here is Oliver Perry looking much younger, but he died in 1819 at the age of 34. His younger brother, Matthew, lived until he was the age of 63. So that's why, despite these picture differences in age, Oliver is the older brother, Matthew is the younger brother. And we should definitely not confuse this Matthew Perry here with this Matthew Perry. This Matthew Perry obviously is not in the 70s funk band The Commodores, but instead the 80s new wave band Flock of Seagulls, which I'm sure is probably another dated reference. This, of course, is Matthew Perry from the series Friends, when he had a Flock of Seagulls haircut. Oh, man. Come on, Flock of Seagulls. So, as seen earlier in our cloth example, the rest of Europe and the United States followed Britain's example and industrialized. Again, they also protected themselves, their own markets using tariffs. So this forced Britain to rely on its old colonies. The same was going to be true for other countries, relying on colonies. From the 1830s on, France really began to colonize in Africa, areas like Algeria, the western coast of Africa, and Madagascar. In Southeast Asia, France had control of areas in modern-day Thailand and Vietnam. And then they had some areas, some islands in the Pacific. In the 1880s, Italy and Germany, both of those very newly unified countries, also joined in the colonization of Africa. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the next lecture. So what we're seeing here is, like I said, Britain forced to rely on their colonies. We see France colonizing. We even see Italy and Germany colonizing. Others will be as well. So at this point, European nation states really began to, at least in part, define themselves by what possessions they held overseas, right? You kind of weren't a true European nation if you didn't hold some overseas colonies. And these colonies were seen in much the same way that workers were in factories. They were just cogs in the money-making machine. What I mean by this is locals had no say in whether or not they would be colonized, right? They also had no say in what they would give, sell, or buy. Basically, all of the major decisions were made by foreigners, especially Europeans and the United States. And here we can see this lovely English imperialist octopus thing with its hands in Egypt, India, Canada, Jamaica, Ireland here, Malta, just all over this British imperial beast. Imperialism was greatly aided by some innovations that had started in the Industrial Revolution. Once the steam power had been adapted to ships, it was first used in riverboats, but then it eventually became a way of propelling ocean ships as well. And these steamships were made of steel, which was stronger, lighter, and cheaper than iron, and those ships, not surprisingly, replaced the old wooden ones. So now we have modern ships like that. And these modern steamships carried raw materials from and then finished products to the colonies. And they did so more quickly and more efficiently. Steam power greatly aided the trade of imperialism, as well as sending more people to colonize. Railroads also became a staple in certain colonies, and what they were really used for was to connect the coast of the colonies to the interiors. And that was so that they could take the wealth out of the interior of the colony and bring it to the coast. So this was more about taking the wealth out of the colony rather than promoting intercolonial trade. These railroads aren't for trade within the colony. Instead, it's for taking the materials out. So it's different than what we saw the railroads in the United States or in Europe being used for. Just to give you some idea of how important they could be in colonies, by 1870, India's rail network was the 5th largest in the world at 4,775 miles long. So, India had this great rail network that was really used just to take the raw materials out of India. Then there was the industrial influence on military technology. Improved military technologies meant that only a small number of Europeans and some pro-imperialist locals like sepoys were needed to dominate large underarmed populations. Right? If you have these machine guns here, we see here is a breech-loading field gun. Then here's a machine gun with multi-shot rifles as well. That meant that you needed less Europeans and, like I said, locals who were on your side to dominate the rest of the population. You could just mow them down with these new weapons. And so these technologies really helped imperialism, and we're going to see how a bit more in the next lecture, which is going to look into Western imperialism again, focusing on the scramble for Africa. So that's kind of really closely tied to this, obviously, right? That's why we have a part 1 of Western imperialism and a part 2. So that's what we'll look at the next lecture. This is Greg, signing off.